Hey, hello everybody. So our topic this week in natural resources is going to be fisheries conservation or fisheries science, learning about just the ecology behind fish and how we would go about understanding them to kind of lead towards management. So we're going to focus for the most part on this lecture on the basic ecological principles of fish and just how fish work. It's going to be slightly different from what you read if you're reading along in the book, but hopefully still pretty useful for you. So the first place we're going to start is talking about the 4 life history strategies of fish. And we got resident, marine, anadromous, and catadromous. And so the first one we'll start off with is the idea of the resident strategy. So these fish are fish that live and reproduce in freshwater. So streams, creeks, lakes, rivers, those sorts of things. But they stay in freshwater. They live in freshwater, stay in freshwater. They don't move around. And a good example of this would be something like a largemouth bass. Marine life history strategy, that is a type of fish that lives and reproduces in marine habitats. So something that grows up in the ocean and stays in the ocean and spends their whole life there. So yellowfin tuna that we have a picture of right here, that's a great example. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting. So you have anadromous. So anadromous fish begin their life in freshwater, then they'll travel to salt water to grow and mature, and then they'll return to their natal stream, the actual one that they were born in, to reproduce and die. And so that is, to me, it's a amazing life history strategy, the amount of effort that the fish have to put in to make that happen. They start off in freshwater, they travel to salt water to grow and mature, and then they come all the way back to where they were born. They reproduce, and as soon as they're done with that, they die. Sockeye salmon, or just any kind of salmon, is a good example of an anadromous fish. And just interesting little fact. When the sockeye salmon are in freshwater, they are red, like in this picture, but when they're in the ocean, they are actually a blue color. And so here is that difference. So you see on the top, that's the freshwater version of the salmon before it heads out to sea, or actually when it comes back from the sea, and then the ocean phase right there, that's the blue version of the same fish before it reaches maturity. So just to kind of give you a little more example of what exactly we're talking about here in terms of an anadromous life cycle. So let's start off with the spawning. So an adult male and adult female come together in a freshwater stream, and they lay eggs. Well, the female lays eggs. Those eggs then are in the stream gravel in a nest called a red in the stream gravel. Those eggs then become fry, and so then they'll spend anywhere between a few days and 4 years still in the freshwater. They will eventually then work their way to the salt water. They'll spend 1 to 4 years in the ocean, work their way all the way back to the stream that they were born, find a partner, reproduce, and then die. And that is the anadromous life cycle. Now the last one, so sorry about that. The next thing, just kind of give you another idea of how that looks. If you're following along with the PDF slides right here in the top right there, there's a video to click on to kind of let you kind of see how that all plays out in terms of the anadromous life cycle of a salmon. So really pay attention to this, because I think it's a cool thing about fish, and I think it's also a really interesting idea as well. So the last of our 4 life history strategies, so resident, marine, anadromous, and now catadromous. So catadromous live in freshwater and reproduce in the marine habitat. So kind of the opposite of the anadromous. And so a European eel is a good example of this one. And so here is the, as described here, the epic life cycle of the European eel. Because taking this European eel as an example, so the eggs are hatched in the ocean, for the eel specifically in the Sargasso Sea, outside of the U.S. in the Atlantic Ocean. Then the larvae drift along currents for about a year, all the way to Europe and North Africa. They'll become what is called a glass eel, and that's the stage where they're most intensively fished. Then they eventually make their way into the freshwater streams of Europe and Africa, and they're a young eel. They become a yellow eel, and that's when they're a yellow eel, that's about 12 to 20 years. Then they'll become a mature silver eel. They're going to start migrating all the way back to where they were born. Might take them 3 years to get across the Atlantic Ocean. They make it back to the Sargasso Sea, and then they mate and they die. And so in that trip, that's about a 4,500-mile trip, and they make that trip when they come back. And so, just to me, the idea of the anadromous and the catadromous life history strategies and the amount of effort that these fish put into their life is pretty amazing. The next part about the ecology of fish that we really want to focus on is the idea of habitat and what is really important in terms of the habitat and the driver of the habitat for fish that make it easy for fish to be successful in terms of a large population. So the basic components, there's 3 basic components of fish habitat that we want to make sure is there and is always available. So you want to have water, of course, because fish live in water. That one, I think, is the easiest one for all of us to understand. The next one, though, is riparian habitat, and we talked about that with the idea of the aquatic ecosystem and the idea of what the habitat provides in terms of that diverse habitat. It provides that filtration system for pollutants to help keep the water clean. It's going to stabilize the bank so it prevents sediment from getting in the water. One thing to think about is that you'll get a lot of insects living in these riparian habitats and other creatures that fish can then feed on if they end up using the water. And so riparian habitat is going to also be important in terms of fish habitat. And then the last one is structure. So on the bottom there, it shows structure in terms of rocks and woody debris and weeds. But basically, the things that fish will need in terms of cover or in terms of plants to eat or in terms of places to lay their eggs and places for them to bed down at night, that's what we're talking about in terms of structure. So those are the 3 basic components of fish habitat, but there's much more to it. So here's kind of an example of what I think some people are used to seeing when they see or they think about fish habitat. We've got our angler, our fisherman right there, but you see we've got all sorts of different things going on in this picture. You got a cattle crossing, you got some brush removal, all these different things that could be part of a fish habitat and could be helpful for fish. Riprap, all these different things. And so when you were thinking about fish habitat, we really want to just think about what does the fish need? How does the fish get its basic needs met in order to be happy and in order to be able to reproduce and keep the population going? And so if we really think about that, we start coming up with some important habitat requirements. And so the things that we really want to think about in terms of fish habitat: temperature, water depth and velocity, turbidity, dissolved oxygen, salinity, substrate, cover, and food supply. So if you think about the habitat, how is a fish going to be happy? It's going to need all of these different things. And so we're going to talk about all of them separately. So the first one is the idea of temperature. And let me just back up real quick. There we go. So in terms of temperature, going back to our basic ecological idea of the law of tolerance, species have specific ranges of tolerances. And that might be different at the different life stages, especially if it's something like an anadromous or a catadromous fish. The temperature of the water could affect the growth rate. It could affect the time of spawning, and fish will move to avoid poor temperatures. Certain fish, like salmon, really need like clean, cold water. And without clean and cold water, they're not going to be able to spawn. They're not going to be able to grow as big as they can. So temperature is a huge, important habitat requirement. Water depth and velocity. I think these pictures really kind of paint the idea of really what we're trying to get at when we're talking about water depth and velocity. So in terms of water depth, if the fish, with this picture of this salmon right here, if the fish is big enough to where it cannot move around in the water, there's not enough depth in the water for it to be able to move around, it's going to struggle to do all the things it needs to in terms of spawning or in terms of moving up and down the river. And then in terms of velocity, some of the animals some of the fish really need a certain speed. Like some fish will be pretty happy in a lake or a lacustrine environment where you don't have a high amount of speed, whereas some fish like the salmon really need that fast current. The current helps them when they're trying to get down out of the water and into the ocean, and then that current basically becomes then the opposite as they're trying to fight their way back. So in terms of water depth and velocity, that still plays an important role in terms of fish habitat. Turbidity. So turbidity, if we're not accustomed to that word yet, it's the measure of the amount of suspended sediment in the water. So when you're looking at water, do we have clean water or do we have murky water? Do we have water that you look at it and you go, oh, that's clean, clear, beautiful, nice and transparent water? Or is it, well, what is all this brown stuff in the water? Because that's what we're talking about with turbidity. Is it clean or is it murky? And so if you look at this chart on this slide, you can see, so in terms of on our x-axis on the bottom there, it says hours, days, weeks, months, and then we have our turbidity units on the left. And you can see that with a little bit of turbidity, our fish are going to show signs of stress. With a lot of turbidity, especially if it starts getting into days as opposed to hours, fish are going to abandon cover. They're going to have increased respiration, which means they're going to affect the dissolved oxygen content. They're going to have reduced feeding rates, increased coughing rates. Then if it gets to weeks, you're going to have reduced growth rates. You're going to have delayed hatchling rates. You're going to have long-term reduction in feeding success. And if you get to months of turbidity and lots of turbidity, you can end up with the death of the fish in the habitat. So it's really important for certain fish species, not for all of them, but for certain ones, to really have clean water without a bunch of sediment in it. And that goes back to then the importance of our riparian zones and being able to keep sediment out of the water. Oh, go back. There we go. So dissolved oxygen. So really the idea to understand what dissolved oxygen is just the oxygen in the water. So fish still breathe oxygen, and other aquatic plants are giving off oxygen because they're in there doing photosynthesis just like the plants up above on the shore. And so it's really important to just understand that. So we're still dealing with oxygen in the water. And so streams where you got water moving, they're usually well oxygenated. So shallow, fast moving water gives you a higher dissolved oxygen content. And when you don't have that fast moving water, you don't have that higher oxygen content. And so we know that there's a certain range in terms of dissolved oxygen that works really well for fish. So you can see in this graphic on this page that when you have greater than 9 parts per million of dissolved oxygen, you can support an abundant fish population. But as you get less and less, it starts to be problematic. So anything below 6 parts per million in terms of dissolved oxygen really starts to become hard. And then we're starting to get into our law of tolerance, where you got stressful conditions, and then anything below 3 parts per million is too low for fish populations. And you can kind of also see in the way that this graphic is done, the idea of it's going from blue to brown, or that idea of the clear water to murky water. And there are some fish that are okay with a little bit of murkiness, like we see, in between 3 and 5. But really, they need oxygen. They need to have some clear water. So it doesn't work well, especially anything less than 3 parts per million. You're not going to have a fish population. So in terms of oxygen in the water, where can they get it? So we're going to talk about the idea of oxygen sources versus oxygen sinks in the water. So a source is how they can get oxygen in the water. How is oxygen actually being produced in the water? Whereas a sink is how is oxygen being used or taken up in the water. And so your sources for oxygen are, of course, atmospheric. So oxygen can be absorbed by the water surface area when it's exposed to air. And then, so how do we increase the surface area of water to then increase the dissolved oxygen content, right? So if oxygen can be pulled in to the water by just being exposed to the surface area, then we should want to get a lot of surface area of water. And the way you can do that is through agitating. Maybe the only other kind of example that people are used to is the idea of agitating is what a washing machine would do. And so where do we see natural agitation, or where do we get these examples of agitation in nature? Waterfalls, rapids, waves, in things that we've made. We make water fountains that kind of that do the same sort of thing. But the idea is that we're increasing the surface area, so there's more surface area that the air can make contact with if the water's moving faster and if the water is flowing. The other source of oxygen is, of course, photosynthesis. So algae and other aquatic plants will release oxygen after going through our basic photosynthetic process, bringing in the sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide, and giving off the oxygen and the sugar. So then in terms of our oxygen sinks, so what's using up our oxygen in the water? So it's the respiration of the fish, the plants, the algae, the bacteria, and other microorganisms within the water are using up that dissolved oxygen. Also, the oxygen content of water is diurnal. It's greater during the day and lower at night. So that's also why you'll see a lot of populations of fish not doing much at night, because the oxygen content is greater during the day, and that allows them to do more during the day. Low dissolved oxygen levels indicate sinks are using more oxygen than can be supplied by the sources. So that's really crucial in terms of the understanding of dissolved oxygen, is that if you're seeing low levels, you have either your population is too big, or you don't have a good source of oxygen, and you've got to solve that problem. Otherwise, your population is going to struggle. So, what can help us kind of manage this idea of oxygen and making sure that we have enough of an oxygen source and not too much of an oxygen sink? There's three big factors in terms of this oxygen solubility and how we make sure that we have enough oxygen in our water. The first one is pressure. So as pressure increases, so does oxygen content. So since high mountain air has less pressure, the oxygen content of water is lower than at sea level. And so why do we see a lot of fish populations and things like that at lower elevations? It's because there's more oxygen content at lower elevations. So if you head up to really high elevations, you're not going to get big, huge populations of fish because of the amount of pressure. Because pressure is going to as you have more pressure, you have more oxygen. And so, just in case we still don't understand how pressure works, and I get that because dealing with weather is kind of difficult, but the idea is that pressure is almost like the idea that there's this invisible layer up above coming down from the clouds. And as you push up through the pressure, you're going to get less pressure because the pressure's pushing down. And so there's a lot of pressure all the way down on the ground. But as you go up, there's less pressure because the pressure is pushed down. So you've kind of pushed through some of that pressure if you get to a higher elevation. But that means that there's less oxygen available. That's also why human beings struggle to live on the top of mountains, where instead we all choose to live closer to lower elevations. You don't see a lot of people living at the top of Mount Everest for this reason. The next factor that's going to affect oxygen solubility is the idea of salinity. So oxygen content increases with decreasing salt content. So fresh water holds more oxygen than salt water. So we're going to get more species in terms of we can get more species in fresh water than in salt water. Now, here's the drawback to that one is we have so much more salt water than we do fresh water because 97% of the world's water is salt water. So we're going to get huge populations of fish in salt water just because we have a ton of salt water on this planet. So that kind of balances out both ways. And then the last one's the temperature. So oxygen content increases with decreasing temperature. So that's why some species of fish really want that cold water because they need that high oxygen content. So it really that becomes another idea as to why riparian habitat and riparian zones are really important in terms of our basic fish habitat, because with increasing temperature you get that decrease in oxygen. It's that inverse relationship. And so our riparian habitat with the trees and the bushes and the grass will help provide shade and help prevent thermal pollution, help prevent the water from getting too hot and keeping it at a nice cold temperature so we can have a high oxygen content in the water. And of those three, temperature by far is the most important. And we can see on this graph here, as dissolved oxygen content, okay, as it decreases, our animal respiration increases. And that's a huge thing to understand, because if there's tons of oxygen, tons of dissolved oxygen in the water, the animals don't have to work as hard, don't have to breathe as hard, and there becomes more oxygen available. But as that dissolved oxygen decreases and as the water gets hotter, because water getting hotter can cause that decrease in dissolved oxygen, then our respiration goes up, and then we start exceeding the amount of oxygen that we have in the water. So that's our problematic part where our sink is going past our sources. So temperature is a huge driver in making sure that there's enough oxygen in the water. With salinity, which we just talked about as well, I've got this graph here. A little complicated to understand, but stick with me. Okay, so when we don't have a lot of salinity, so if we're looking on the x-axis down at the bottom there, so if we have between 0 and 5% salinity, in terms of fresh water, where we don't have a high salt content, you can get a ton of species, and that's what we're seeing on the right. So if we don't have a lot of salinity, we get a ton of species, especially freshwater species. If we have a little bit of salinity, so between 5 and 10%, or a medium amount of salinity, we start to see we get a good amount of brackish species, because that's what we're going to see in our estuaries. We'll see a good amount of brackish species. As we get more salinity, we're going to see an amount of marine species as well, because these ones are the ones living in salt water, so they're going to have a good amount of species as well. But as you get to a lot of salinity, even the marine species, even the ones out living in salt water, even they can't handle it. And that's why you see that tiny little tail when we go past the marine species, because the marine species can handle more salinity. You can see that all of our marine species exist between, roughly 7.5 and for the most part like 20%. But once you get past 20% salinity, even that, for the most part, is too much for the majority of marine species. There's that little tail out there because there are some that can handle more salinity, because as we know in terms of our basic ecology, there's always going to be a few animals who are going to try and hit that different niche so that they don't have to compete. And so that's how you read that chart there. But the important thing to just really understand with salinity is, for our freshwater species, a little bit of salinity is okay, but not too much. For our brackish species and our marine species, they're going to be able to tolerate a decent amount of salinity, but even for them, there is a level of salinity where it's too much. And the last point to make on that one is that the idea of salt levels can limit the movement of organisms. So depending on where that salt water is in a place, if there's a higher concentration of salinity in one part than another part, that can actually prevent the fish from moving into that area. So in terms of the substrate, so what is the substrate? It's the bed material, so the stuff at the bottom of the river or the lake. Usually gravel is kind of what we think about for the most part. Rocks, gravel, some sediment, things like that. That's what makes up the substrate. So this becomes really important during spawning activities. For the most part, gravel beds make good spawning grounds, because the gravel has pores that allow water to pass through, so that the water can hit the eggs and continue to move through, but allow for the nest to stay there. And mentioned it earlier, but a redd is a nest placed in gravel to deposit and fertilize the eggs. So trout and salmon both do this. And in the video that you watched, you should have seen a little bit of that happening. Cover. Oh, too far. So in terms of cover, on the bottom left there, I've got a video from Texas Fish and Wildlife, which explains the idea of how, if you don't have cover in your area, and that's also the same, we mentioned it earlier in terms of the three things that fish need, the three basic things. Cover would also go into that idea of structure, and you're basically trying to provide structure for the fish. So when we're saying cover, we're talking about plants and rocks and weeds and woody debris and all of those things that help the fish to be able to escape from other fish and give them a place to rest and give them a place to also maybe escape if the water's getting too hot. They can go underneath and catch some shade. And so if you don't have a lot of cover in the place that you're at, you can make cover for fish. And so that video should kind of show you how that process goes about. But some of the things that you can do if you don't have riparian vegetation or large woody debris is you can come up with these artificial structures. And so there's a couple pictures on the right there of different artificial structures. And usually if you like these ones on the right here where you see that they have pipes or tubes, usually they're made to a certain size so that fish can go in and out and dart in and out of them and go kind of through them, and that becomes helpful to make sure that they can still move around in the water and still have this little bit of structure that helps them with their daily life. And then the food supply. Sorry, I'm over clicking. But in terms of your food supply, just making sure that there's a proper food supply. And that, once again, goes back to our three important basics of fish habitat, is that the riparian habitat can really help with influencing the fish habitat and making sure that there is that constant food supply and providing, making sure that there's insects and other life that are around that will allow there to be an abundant food supply for the fish. And so just some quick examples here. So on the left is a food web from Lake Mead, which is the Hoover Dam area in Nevada. And so you can see that there's all sorts of different things that go into the idea of the food cycle there, in terms of you got your near shore plants, insects, and algae that comes from the riparian habitat, and then those fish feed off of that, the other fish feed off of them. You've also got the invertebrates and the plankton and all of that. And then on the right you can see, well, what happens out in the ocean. So the Bering Sea food web are there, where you've got whales and you've got seals, and then you've got large adult fish, and you've got some forage fish that get eaten by the larger fish, and then you got the invertebrates and the plankton, as well as the bottom-dwelling invertebrates. And so that's just kind of the idea of the food supply, and how do we make sure that there is a food supply, and how do these food webs work in terms of fisheries. So what can be problematic? So we talked about the three main important things for fish habitat. We've talked about the life history strategies of fish, and then we broke down all the important things in the habitat for the fish. So what are the problems then that are gonna affect our fish populations? And one of the big things to really look at is the idea of natural limitations versus artificial limitations. So naturally, what are going to be the problems? Well, storms are going to be a problem because it's going to move things around. If you have any sort of mass movements from erosion, like mudslides, or you get a high amount of turbidity from lots of sediment being put into the water, that can be problematic. Any sort of natural barriers, you got waterfalls, or you got water velocity issues. Vegetation disturbances, losing trees and having shade loss and having an increase in temperature, and then just having predators will also be problematic. And those, really, when we're looking at fish populations, we're really looking at how does this affect reproduction, because that's really going to be key. If we have good reproduction, then the fish will keep coming back and we'll keep having a healthy population. Then we just worry about, how's the temperature, how's the How's the water depth and velocity? How is our salinity? And we can kind of make these continual checks. So here's just the idea. Took this table straight from the book. I did highlight down here at the bottom, it says, note that these natural events in the long term may in some cases actually increase productivity and improve habitat quality. It can happen sometimes. It's not always the case, but it can happen. And so I include this table here because you can look and see what those problems could be. And then also on the right, it says what the actual specific effects are on the fish. And so what are our human-induced or our problems that can be caused anthropogenically? So water pollution or eutrophication issues, which we talked about before, coming from farming practices, alteration of the temperatures if we're the ones cutting down the trees or reducing riparian habitats, predation and competition. So overfishing, and then in terms of competition by exotics, having invasive species being induced that then also can predate the natural population. Our own human consumption, the idea that we eat a lot of fish and we take a lot of fish, and our fishing practices sometimes are okay, and sometimes we have some fishing practices that are actually really harmful to the fish habitat environment and can change the habitat quite a bit. A really good example of that is trawling. And if you don't know what trawling is, that's the idea that basically they take a boat, they throw out a huge net with weights on it, and the net just goes and sinks all the way down to the bottom of the ocean, and then it just scrapes along the bottom of the ocean, and it picks up whatever they can off of the ocean and into that net, and it's really can be damaging to marine environments. Dams, we've spoken about the problems with dams and what they can cause, and really the big thing with dams in terms of fish populations is they can change the water velocity and even the water depth, and then they can also have the problems in terms of migration patterns. And they know they've tried to mitigate that with fish ladders, but it still definitely affects the population. Definitely accelerated erosion issues and sedimentation problems within the habitat, because we want to have clean water, and that can be problematic. And then channelization. So if we start creating other channels or aqueducts and moving water to different places where water should be, that becomes a real issue. And that's something that's fairly obvious in terms of the Kern River, because we can see what the Kern River could look like and how much water could be going through the Kern River, but we've got water going off into different canals and aqueducts, and it's really affected the way that the Kern River actually flows. So here is the table again, but this time the human-induced problems and then the effect on the fish and their habitats. And that's what I've got for this week in terms of fisheries science, fisheries conservation, really focused on the ecology. So big things to remember are the life history strategies, the 3 basic necessities in terms of our fish habitat, and then some of the important drivers in terms of what affects fish habitat. And then the last part that we focused on are what are the things that could cause problems to fish habitat. So hope you enjoyed it.